A few installments back, when I initially introduced the idea of balanced whole body unified force, I said that there were some elements of that idea that I didn't want to talk about at that point because it would make things less clear rather than more clear at that point. It would muddy the waters and affect our progression moving forwards. And I said then that we'll come back to that idea, we'll come back to that discussion at a point in time in the future, and that's that point of time right now. So if you've been following along with the exercises so far, you will have experienced something of balanced whole body unified force and imbalanced whole body unified force. And of course, these are two aspects of precisely the same thing. And the difference between them is the idea that we want to really get at today. The thing that we started looking at in the exercise in the last installment, which put simply is whether you skew or don't skew a posture, or the degree to which you do that, or in other words, how far your posture is balanced and how far it's imbalanced. And this is going to help us understand some of the really important and interesting things, particularly the difference between so-called health-based Yiquan and fight-based Yiquan. And I think most people who are interested in Yiquan have probably heard about this division, and maybe you've done some research, and you may even have seen someone at some point say something like, well, the health-based Yiquan and the fight-based Yiquan are really just different stages of the Yiquan progress. They're not really separate things in that sense. It's that the health-based Yiquan is the foundation. It's the basic training that everyone does, and then only some people move on from that into the fight-based Yiquan. However, you're very unlikely to find anyone explaining why. Why does it work like that? Why is the basic training the same for everyone and then only some people move on into the fight-based Yiquan? And what's the difference between the two? And that's usually phrased in some kind of sense of, well, you just do harder training for the fight-based, but that's not it at all, and that's really what we want to understand and explain today. So the thing that I didn't want to muddy the waters with a few episodes back is that balanced whole body unified force, as I've alluded to before, isn't really very useful for martial arts practice. It's not quite that simple because in each one we use something called dynamic rootedness, which is the rapid shift between single and double weightedness. And I'll talk again at another point about that in more detail, and I'll talk about the essay that Yao Zhongzun's student Bo Jiakong wrote about this to try and explain this concept. There's too much to get across in any one short session to talk about everything. But in short, we can say that we use balanced whole body unified force in fight-based Yiquan, but we use it dynamically in the shift between balanced and imbalanced unified force. Anyway, the idea of balanced whole body unified force not being useful kind of goes against the grain, and I've mentioned this before. The idea of balance itself semiotically represents something positive, or it seems to represent something positive, and particularly in the context of Chinese physical culture. And think about even in Yiquan, the idea of the doctrine of the mean, finding the balance between different opposites. It seems such a absolutely critical and important concept, which it is, and it goes deep back into the ancient history of Chinese physical culture. And if you don't know this story, the cultural shift in China at some point in the distant past, we don't know exactly when, from the belief, the overarching belief in illness and problems, maladies in daily life coming from some kind of spirit possession, so ancient shamanic beliefs in spirit possession, at some point gets radically overtaken. It doesn't disappear, but it gets radically overtaken by the concept of balance. So think about things like 5 elements theory that you've probably heard about if you're interested in Chinese martial arts. And you've also probably looked at plenty of Taoist writings, so you understand this idea that comes about in China at a certain point in historical time, where the concept of balance takes on this overriding importance, and balancing everything. And think about how forward thinking that is, by the way, in terms of healthcare, and how important that is now, the idea of a balanced diet, a balanced lifestyle, a balanced work-life relationship, and so on. And so it seems like a little bit of a circle that we've somehow got to square, that actually that's not the thing that we really need for fight-based Yiquan. How do we make sense of that? So, as ever in Yiquan, our key conceptual tool is contradictory thinking, looking at everything from a different angle, and usually from a different angle to the way that everyone else is looking at it from. So sure, balance is good for us, but in martial arts, what do we want to do? Bottom line, as Zhao Daoxin, Wang Shangjai student says, the bottom line for martial arts, despite everything else, all the health benefits, cultural benefits, psychological benefits, the bottom line is you want to deal with an opponent. You want to hurt or neutralize an opponent. So you don't want what's good for them. So if imbalance you kind of think is a bad thing, well, that's what you want for your opponents. You want the bad thing for them. You want to use imbalance to affect them in a negative way. Or in short, what's bad for them is good for us. So that squares the circle for us. If imbalance is a bad thing, well, that's what we want for our opponent. We want to put them down. We want to throw them. We want to punch them in the face. We want to neutralize that threat one way or another. In push hands, for example, our key aim is to infect the opponent's structure with imbalance, and the whole art in many ways is you imbalance your structure, and when you're connected one way or the other to your opponent's structure, you pass on that imbalance into their structure. You infect their structure with the imbalance in your structure, but you do it so fast and you do it in a way that you can control it, and they've got to react to it in time. And if they can't, then their structure is infected with imbalance and you gain the advantage. So it's all about using imbalanced force to your advantage. And if you do that with a short, sharp movement, which is one of the things that we're after in each one, let's say continuing to think about this paradigm of push hands, you use a short, sharp movement to infect their structure with imbalance, and they've got to react, and they've got to react very fast. You do it, you're in control of it, you've got the jump on them, and they've got to react in a split second. And if they can't, then their structure will be infected. You'll have control of your structure because of your training, because you can use hit and stop. And that's the way that we infect their structure, with imbalance. And because we can use hit and stop, yes, our own structure is unbalanced. This is the way we do it. We dramatically, dynamically, explosively unbalance our own structure, but because of our training, because we can use hit and stop, because we've been practicing standing pole, we can suddenly freeze that posture in a moment. That transmits the force into the opponent's structure. They've got to react to that. If they can't, if their reactions aren't fast enough, then we've got an advantage, and that's the point where we can hit them. And you know what I want to do, this whole project is about sharing something amazing. Each one is an amazing thing. It's a profound, a gift. It doesn't just come from Wang Shangjai. Wang Shangjai himself tells us that, it's the quintessence of Chinese physical culture. That's a dangerous idea in itself, because it puts people in a position of being the prophet of that Chinese physical culture, as if one person could know everything about it. I don't mean it like that. I mean that there's this amazing thing that we can explore, what in each one we call the infinite curriculum. Once we understand the essential principles of this thing, we can explore it. Like science is a wonderful thing, so each one, in its sense of being the science of Chinese physical culture, as Wang Shangjai called it, is an amazing transformational thing for everyone, no matter what kind of martial arts you do, or whether it's about health practice or just living better lives through better physical culture. It's an amazing thing, and yet the pushback against the mission is just unbelievable. Some of the stuff that people write about me is just off the scale. So I have to remind myself, and now I realise I've got to remind other people, that This isn't stuff that's just coming from me. It's not just me against the world. It's me and Wang Xiangjai and a few others against the world. And the way to make that clear now, I think, is just to highlight the truth, the reality of what Wang Xiangjai himself was actually arguing. So one of the things that I have to canute against the tide, this absolute tide of nonsense about exotic forces and magical mystical powers that supposedly arrive if you just do standing pole, what Wang Xiangjai's student Han Sihuan calls Zhanzhuang ideation, like the kind of cultish celebration of Zhanzhuang as if it can give you some kind of exotic power. Anyway, what I want to do is just give a bit of a quote from Wang Xiangjai where he's talking about exactly this idea of hit and stop, so you can understand that this isn't something I've just made up. This is the truth. And you may just hear my dog, who's just turned up and is trying to sit on my knee. This is a quote from a section of Wang Xiangjai's book on breaking hands, and it's a section where he's talking about the technique of dragon expels ambergris, so that's how it translates from the Chinese. And this is the posture you'll have seen where you engage an opponent's guard and you just spin them and push them away. So dragon spits out ambergris is like you're spitting out the opponent, so your arms are like the dragon's mouth. It's fairly straightforward, I know that. If you don't know what ambergris is, by the way, look it up. It's like a bunch of crap that a whale spits out, like the remains of something that it's eaten, and it coagulates into this stuff that's apparently very fragrant. It's what they used to make the oil out of that anointed the kings of England. Anyway, Wang Xiangjai says regarding this technique that I'm discussing, this refers to the expansion form of the Hunyuan pile. The subtlety of this form lies in its triangular spiral force. Both the overall body and the arms and legs must follow the rules of this triangular spiral force in their movement. It's crucial to use the overall rotational force to drive the rotational movements of both arms and legs, ensuring that the local movements follow the overall movement without disrupting it. The internal power, true strength, generated by the rotational swing of the waist and spine, propels the arms to extend and retract in a continuous rotation. When the arms extend forward, the spiral advances, generating the centrifugal force. When the arms retract backward, the spiral retreats, generating centripetal force. Utilizing the principle of abruptness and smoothness, when the extension and retraction of the arms are about to end and begin respectively, coordinated with the movement of the waist and legs, both arms should suddenly stop, converting the rotational force into explosive force, extending all the way to the fingertips. At this moment, the testing of strength becomes the point of force application. This kind of transformation can be hidden or evident, and the extent of concealment and revelation should be based on one's own perception. When the intention does not move inwardly, the strength does not manifest outwardly. From the perspective of combat effectiveness, when both arms spiral forward, the pivot acts like a rolling thread. The shoulders and elbows are like machine wheels, drawing in and transforming the opponent's force imperceptibly. The triangular force accumulates, twisting directly for a strike, abruptly releasing and disrupting the opponent's balance, leaving marks in their vision and chest. Meanwhile, when both arms spiral backward, the force does not resist. The elbows, wrists and back act like rolling beads and wooden edges, intercepting and redirecting, concealing straightness within curves, momentarily holding oneself back, swallowing the opponent's force imperceptibly, with my arm already engraved in the bones of the opponent's wrist. This is the invisible ebb and flow of rotational force, leaving marks in retreat. The triangular spiral blending, curves with straightness, acting like a lever and pulley mechanism with a long reach. This method is the fundamental skill of Da Cheng Chuan. In the past, among my friends who practiced Da Cheng Chuan, few could master this method well. Not to mention those I didn't teach in detail. In fact, they did not fully understand the principle of abruptness and smoothness. Here, I specially point it out, hoping the future learners will strive for it. When practicing, one must constantly realise the transformation of rotational force into explosive force, borrowing the rotational force to emit explosive force. End quote. And the one mistake that I made there, I didn't want to stop because I was reading it out, when he says, meanwhile, when both arms spiral backward, the force does not resist the elbows, wrists and backs of the hands, not back, not your back. The backs of your hands act like rolling beads on wooden edges. So he's talking about a lot of things there, and he's talking particularly about when you intercept an opponent's movement and you use their force against them, but he's also talking about what he means by internal force, and it's clear that he doesn't mean something like some kind of exotic force. And conflating that with qi is also very problematic, because Wang Xiangjia uses the idea of qi, but he doesn't see that as the same thing as what either internal force in the way that it's used as a kind of exotic force, which we know Wang Xiangjia says he has no idea what is meant by that. What Wang Xiangjia means by internal force is the mechanical movement of the body as it all knits together into an overall structure, and the way that it functions using, well, we've talked about spiral force and we've talked about triangular force before. But the most important point that I wanted to make there was this idea of hit and stop, and how Wang Xiangjia sees it as the absolutely essential defining feature of Da Chen Chuan. And I'll tell you something, it doesn't really matter what Wang Xiangjia says. The people who've invested in creating versions of Yiquan that completely contradict Wang Xiangjia actually don't care what he said. And I've experienced this multiple times now, where people create these rhetorical boxes that they, they'll say things like, well, the Communist Party made him say that, or he only taught the real stuff secretly to my master's master's master, when it's totally contradictory to this, and all this kind of nonsense, all these kind of lies, to somehow, no matter what Wang Xiangjia says, their nonsense somehow still is true. But the problem with all of that is the thing that Wang Xiangjia is talking about actually works, and the thing that they're talking about doesn't. Anyway, another thing that Wang Xiangjia is talking about there is disrupting the opponent's structure. So you're infecting the opponent's structure with your movement. And what we need to know is, beyond the metaphors of pulleys and levers, and just note, by the way, how mechanical Wang Xianjia's thinking is. And that's also, remember, a product of his time. Wang Xiangjia is not a prophet. He's a human being who's a product of his time. Industrialization, machines, that was the spirit of the age, the transformational thing in China. So it's inevitably going to get into his thinking and become the basis of the metaphors that he uses, just like I very often use computers and programming metaphors, and in the future there'll be some other kind of technology that some other Yiquan practitioner will be using to explain these ideas. As always, follow the feeling. Even with the practical application, follow the feeling, not the metaphor. Just keep in mind that he clearly is talking about structure and the structure of the body, and he's using internal. When we say Neijie, it has these different meanings, because internal, just like in English, can have multiple different meanings, and Wang Xiangjia is clearly talking about the internal workings of the body in the way that they knit together in a very sophisticated way. In a way that's so sophisticated, it's so much more interesting, and it's so much more rewarding, and it's so much more obviously practically possible than these kind of mystical fantasies about magical forces or whatever it is that certain individuals believe that each one is about. In any case, the point here is that to generate force, you have to shift from a balanced to an imbalanced posture, and we call that skewing a posture. And Wang Xiangjia himself tells us this, that you develop balanced whole body unified force, but that's essentially useless on its own. You need to then skew the posture in order to be able to direct the kinetic force that you generate. And you generate kinetic force by skewing the posture dynamically, explosively, and then you need to direct that kinetic force to a particular point. For example, throwing a jab, you skew the posture, you're side on, you skew the posture, and the force goes to the punch point. And you'll understand all of this, including lock points and transmission of force, if you've got a dog and you throw a ball for the dog using one of those ball throwers. And most people find when you try and do it at first, you try and throw the ball with a ball thrower, it just hits the ground in front of you. You can't propel the ball out of the ball thrower. It just smashes into the ground. And then after a bit of practice, you find that you can somehow propel the ball forwards a great distance, and what you're doing is imperceptibly creating a lock point with your whole structure as you skew to hurl the ball forwards. When the ball thrower's in midair, you create imperceptibly a lock point at that point, and that's what forces the ball to fly out of the ball thrower. And it's exactly the same law of physics that Wang Changchai is talking about, and it's exactly the same use of skewing and then hit and stop. So it's an absolutely essential concept, and it's an absolutely essential physical skill within Yiquan, and it's very important to understand this so that we can then move on to explore cases where it's a little bit more complicated. But next, we want to consider some elements of balanced whole body unified force and why we sometimes talk about those as being good for health benefits.